Warning, the video you're about to watch contains mathematics at the level of college algebra and trigonometry. All material has an assumed prerequisite of both Algebra 1, which is elementary algebra, and Algebra 2, which is intermediate algebra. While some prerequisite topics are reviewed briefly, a more thorough review of these entrance topics can be found by searching the web.
It's the system of equations. We must deal with them all at once. Always looking for solutions. Positive outlook overcomes.
Hello, my name is Roy Simpson, professor of mathematics at Cosumnes River College in Sacramento, California. This video is another video on a review for college algebra students on functions, and this time we're tackling one-to-one functions and what it means for a function to be one-to-one. There's not much I really need to say about this. We've actually seen by definition of a function that, well, if you're handed a function, then each input leads to a single output. A one-to-one function, well, it's first of all a function, so each input leads to a single output, but it has a very special feature that each output leads back to only one input. So the relation between x and y is that each input of x leads to only one output of y, that's why it's a function, and each output of y only comes from one input of x. That makes it a one-to-one function. Now compare this to our discussion earlier in a previous video about what makes something a function or a relational function is that each input leads to a single output, but it is not necessary for each output to be born of a single input. So in this case, you're seeing that y1 maps backwards to x1 and x2, but it's still a function because x1 only goes to y1, and x2 only goes to y1, and x3 only goes to y2. So each input only goes to a single output. However, even though that's a function, it is not a one-to-one function. To be one-to-one, we need that mapping to go both directions. In other words, the input of x1 only goes to y1 and y1 only leads back to x1. That would be a one-to-one function. And the only example I have in this video is asking, is this function, first of all, a one-to-one function? It is a function, by the way, but is it one-to-one? Well, each input goes to only one output. That is actually true in this case. So an input of, let's say, 0, it leads only to 3. An input of 3 leads only to 7. Input of 4 leads only to 7. And you could try an infinite number of inputs. Each of those inputs leads to a single output. However, is it one-to-one? And the answer to that is no. And the reason why is obvious from what we've written. 3 leads to 7 as an output, and the input of 4 also leads to 7. And because 7 is an output that leads back to two completely different inputs, this is not one-to-one. And by the way, when we write one-to-one, some people write it this way, which is perfectly fine, just means 1-1. That's totally okay. There really is not much else to say about one-to-one functions other than that they are incredibly important, mainly because we want our functions to be one-to-one. Maybe I should say it this way, that when you're handed a relation between two sets of objects, you first of all want it to be a function. In other words, each input goes to a single output. But you'd really love it if it was a one-to-one function. In other words, not only does each input lead to a single output, but each output leads back to only a single input. Think of this in terms of crime scene investigation. It would be great if crimes were one-to-one. In other words, you show up at a crime scene and something's happened, like somebody's murdered or something like that. If everything was one-to-one, you would know exactly who did it because only one person would murder this other person or whatever, right? So one-to-one functions are highly desirable because then you can pretty much go back and forth between inputs and outputs identically. Since this is just a review, there's not much else I need to say about that. We'll go into deeper detail about one-to-one functions and their inverses later on in this video series.
It's the system of equations. We must deal with them all at once. Always always looking for solutions. Positive outlook overcomes obstacles getting in our way, cause affects more than we can sometimes see. Things for what they are and work together until you feel at peace. Says, listen close, don't talk too much that isn't kosher. You may really hurt inside. It doesn't justify you to speak too loud and cry.